Hello and welcome to Solimar International's Sustainable Tourism Learning Series. My name is Chris Seek, the CEO of Solimar, and today I'm going to be going over how to develop an effective tourism strategy for your destination. The first But the question is, how do you develop a tourism strategy that's implemented and doesn't end up on the shelf? Based upon our tourism planning and implementation experience in more than 500 destinations from around the globe, we know that tourism strategies often fail, but rarely because of a lack of good ideas. In our experience, we believe the process is just as important as the end product. We see the keys to successful strategic tourism planning include first, a buy-in and consensus from the wide range of public and private stakeholders that will be needed for successful strategy execution. We use a variety of different tools, proven approaches for achieving that buy-in and consensus that I'll talk about later. Second is detailed action plans that clearly define timelines, responsibilities, and the human and financial resources that will be required for plan implementation. Unlike most tourism planners, Solimar implements most of the tourism development strategies that we developed. That experience gives us valuable perspectives in defining action plans that are time-bound, practical, and achievable. And then third, we need to focus on demand-driven solutions. While policy frameworks, training, and infrastructure development are all important components of a comprehensive tourism development plan, increased demand is the primary and ultimately the only sustainable driver of more frequent and affordable airlift, product diversification, and improved service delivery. Solimar's strategic planning process is centered around helping tourism stakeholders answer four main questions. First, we need to ask, where are we now? Second, we need to understand, where do we want to go? Third, how do we get there? And finally, how do we know we've arrived? To answer the first question of where are we now, we need to understand the current situation of the tourism industry. How is the industry performing? How do we compare to our competition? What are our tourism assets? What tourism services are available for visitors? Who is responsible for tourism policy, management, marketing, investment, etc.? How is the industry organized? But most importantly, what are the main challenges that are preventing our industry from reaching its full potential? Through a careful review of tourism statistics, previous studies, online research, and interviews and surveys with tourism stakeholders, we're able to develop a tourism sector analysis or tourism situation analysis that sets the foundation for the tourism strategy. Next, we need to know, where do we want to go? The vision statement is one of the most important components of a tourism strategy. The objective of the visioning process is to build consensus around a shared vision for the future of the tourism industry and the destination. Solimar uses a variety of different approaches to create a shared vision, but this is mainly achieved through a participatory planning workshop where stakeholders come together and think into the future and describe a tourism industry that they would like to see for their destination. How has the tourism changed from today? What has improved? What remains the same? Asking tourism stakeholders to describe their desired future of the tourism industry shows that while stakeholders have many different opinions about what needs to be done and what should be prioritized, they often share a common vision for what they want tourism to look like in the future for their destination. Once a shared vision is agreed upon, the next question is how the vision will be achieved and how best to organize the action plans to be implemented. While every tourism destination is unique and has its own challenges and priorities, most tourism strategies tend to prioritize 5 to 6 main pillars of the strategy that we call strategic objectives or strategic goals. These tend to be focused around improving the policy or the coordination of the industry, marketing, product or destination development, workforce development, sustainability, and other topics that flow from the planning process. After defining these main pillars, the next and most important step of the strategic planning process is to define the specific strategies to be implemented to achieve these goals. Strategies are the main components of a tourism strategy and what provides the direction for the industry to realize the vision. Through stakeholder interviews and outcomes from the tourism planning workshop, these strategies are identified and grouped under corresponding goals. A description of each strategy is important to help everyone understand what is being proposed and why. This is what this looks like in a strategy framework. First, we define the vision. Then we identify the main goals that will lead to the vision. And then we identify the strategies to achieve each of the goals. The last and very important step to identify how we get there is the creation of detailed action plans. These action plans are developed through working groups that include the public and private sector, conservation and community organizations, and other stakeholders. The key to action planning is aligning the action plan process with the government's own annual work planning and budgeting. This way, the tourism strategy gets integrated into each government agency's annual work plans and budgets. So under each strategy, we would identify the specific actions that are needed to implement the strategy, identify who will lead the action, the timeline, what the cost or resources are required, and finally, the success indicator that will show the action has been completed. The last question we need to answer is, how do we know we've arrived to the vision that we set out? Indicators are an important tool in a tourism strategic plan so that we can define the quantifiable targets that can be used to measure the results of the strategy implementation process. Indicators should include not only the economic performance of the industry, but also sustainability and other policy-focused metrics that demonstrate progress towards realizing the vision and communicate progress of the tourism strategy. Now that we understand the main questions that need to be answered during a strategic planning process, let's actually go through how Solimar approaches and works with our clients in order to develop a strategic plan. I'm going to walk you through the 4 phases of our planning process, starting first with phase 1, where we look and review our prior studies, benchmarking, and conduct our research to be prepared for our assignment. Next, we work with our client to help identify who should be involved in the main strategy task force and specific committees that need to be created. Phase 3 is where we reach out to the broader group of tourism stakeholders to have extensive consultation and conversations to understand how they feel and make sure that they are taking part in feeling ownership of the tourism strategy. And then with that information, we develop the strategy and make sure, again, that the stakeholders have an opportunity to be consulted and validate the strategies being processed. Now let's go ahead and take you through each one of these. In phase 1, when we organize the team, the first thing we want to do is have a conference call or, if possible, an in-person meeting with our client to discuss the overall approach and our roles and responsibilities, process, and milestones. Again, we see ourselves as facilitators in bringing a process and international expertise to the table, but at the end of the day, we need our client really to be the one who's leading the process and bringing the industry together. So with this meeting, we then walk through the process we're going to use, the timeline, what's the communication materials that we use for engaging the industry. These might be surveys, they might be the terms of reference for the task force committee, invitations to attend a workshop, a fact sheet, etc. It's very important to have these communication materials established and vetted with our client before we start using them to communicate with the industry. And then what we always recommend is to start with a meeting of the highest level of government authority who will drive the strategy development process and ensure a whole of government support of this process implementation. The higher up of support for the strategy, the more likely different government agencies will take the strategy process seriously, even though they might fall outside of a Ministry of Tourism or Department of Tourism. Since tourism requires a whole of government approach, we recommend strongly to our clients to create some type of national tourism strategy task force. Now, this is if we're doing a national strategy. If we're doing a regional strategy, it's the same approach. What we need is we need to make sure that the different government agencies that are involved in tourism, whether that be the protected area authorities, the conservation, heritage managers, security, workforce, education. These are different types of government agencies who all play a role in tourism development. So we need to make sure that they're part of the strategy as well. Now, what we recommend is not to bring in the highest level ministers or things like that. It's more the technical people within these agencies who can work together in order to identify and address the issues. We also want to invite academic and NGO tourism specialists, since they play a very important role and bring wonderful expertise as well. And then from here, we need to work with our client to send out invitations to make sure people understand why we're asking them to join the committee and what the purpose is. But even from those letters, what we also find that one-on-one meetings with these agency heads to make sure they understand what we're doing, why their involvement is important, and getting their buy-in so they appoint the right person to join this task force and participate. And then finally, a task force kickoff meeting and presentation that summarizes the strategy, the outline, and describes the process. So again, that everyone feels like they are helping develop this strategy, and it's not just the Ministry of Tourism or the Department of Tourism strategy. Once we have the task force established and we have buy-in from all of government, next we need to reach out to the broader stakeholders that are involved in tourism. This is obviously your tourism industry, your private sector, but it's also things like communities, guides, transportation companies. So it's not just the big companies like the hotel owners and tour companies, even though they play a very important role. So in order to do this, it's important to kind of make sure that the government highlights and lets everyone know that this process is getting started. I always recommend to involve the media and celebrate and highlight the goals of why they're creating a strategy and getting everyone excited about this process. Then through what we recommend is roundtable meetings or individual one-on-one interviews, we really want to get a sense of what are the key issues and challenges facing the industry. Again, we know that the private sector understands what are the biggest issues and challenges. We just need to get them to feel comfortable sharing what they see as the problems and challenges so that we can understand what the strategy needs to address. At the same time we're doing this, we also want to start planning for a larger workshop where we identify a location, if we're going to do regional workshops all over the country or just one central location. Then we distribute the invitation to stakeholders to make sure that we have the right people in the room with the right representation. And we also recommend developing an online survey. For those who don't have the time to spend a day in a meeting to talk about the problems, they can just go ahead quickly online to share their opinions about what the major issues are. And then finally, it's the idea of creating a workshop where we facilitate a discussion and to understand and identify the inputs from the stakeholders themselves. So this is what a workshop agenda would look like. And we can customize this. We've made this as quick as a 2-hour meeting all the way to a 2-day meeting. But basically, the sessions are pretty standard. I always recommend starting off with the first session of having introductions and objectives. And what I see here is one of the most important things is really reaching out to, again, those highest level of different government officials to be part of the official welcome and remarks. Giving the head of tourism, the protected area authority, the cultural heritage authority, different opportunities to give the opening remarks, again, shows that this strategy is not just the Department of Tourism, it's the whole country's, and it's important for everyone. Then we also want to make sure that everyone understands what the goals are for the workshop. And then we give everyone a chance to introduce themselves so that people know who's in the room and what perspective they bring to the table. The next session we go into is answering the first question that I talked about earlier. Where are we now? So what we'd like to do here is give a summary of the situation analysis by delivering a PowerPoint that summarizes all the key statistics and analysis that were conducted during the situation analysis, but also most importantly, identify what we heard from those interviews or what are the key issues that are preventing the tourism industry from realizing their potential. Even though we've shared this and summarized this, we want to make sure we validate those key issues. So the very first exercise, and this is really important with the strategic planning, is that we give people the chance to have small group breakout discussions. And we ask them to look at the priority issues and to discuss and decide what they feel are the main issues that the strategy should address. And this is really about ranking so that we know what people feel are the most important things that need to be addressed. After that, we also recommend a small coffee break. And then during that time, we let people through stickers or just checking off with a pen to identify on what are they see are the main and the most important issues. So again, individually, everyone can identify and we start to see what the biggest issues are. Then as we move into the next session of where do we want to go, this is our visioning setting exercise. And I've done this a couple different ways over the years. And what I'd like to do is ask people to imagine it's the future, let's say the year 2030. And I assign one person in the group to be a reporter, maybe from CNN or some other news agency. And they basically are going to interview people at their table who take on different personas. One person can be the mayor, one person can be a visitor, one person can be a hotel owner, and basically, the reporter is going to ask them how tourism is performing and what the way it's working and how they feel tourism's going. And this fun exercise is always a great way to get people laughing, but it also, most importantly, you start to see a theme here. You start to hear certain kind of priorities from the stakeholders. They might talk about how the destination's clean and there's no trash. They might talk about how the local community is the ones benefiting from tourism, or they might talk about the role that women play in the tourism industry. These statements that they're making during this fun exercise are really important because you're starting to identify what they see as the most important things that they want to see changed in the destination. And as each group goes around and shares their little vision here, you start to identify what are the common themes from everyone in the group. And again, even in the difficult destinations that we've worked in, where there's been a lot of conflict, never once have we not been able to develop a vision that everyone agreed to. After lunch, we bring everyone back and we ask everyone to now start thinking about how do we get there. And this is where we go through the action planning exercise. We identify the issues that were prioritized, and we ask the groups to think about, okay, if you feel like there's a lack of English speaking guides, what is needed in order to address that problem? And they start thinking through and coming up with strategic ideas of how to address that issue. After each group goes around and brainstorms, then they collectively report out to the larger group. And again, we're capturing all of this to try to identify where there's commonalities. A lot of times what we also like to do in this exercise is group the tables around these different themes so that people can self-select and work on the strategies that are most important to them. Then we move into the last session of the day, which is how do we know we arrived? And this is where we ask them to look at different types of indicators and to help identify which indicators are the most important they feel should be part of the performance review of the strategy. So again, we want to get people to think beyond just how many visitors come to a destination. Let's think about how much money they're spending, how long they're staying in the destination. Let's also look at the sustainability indicators, things like the amount of trash that might be collected in a destination. We want to help them think about what indicators are important that the strategy should measure, and that should be aligned to the vision statement that was developed. And then finally, it's always important to wrap it up with the kind of a public commitments to actions and next steps. So we want to hear from those same people who introduced the day to talk about how important the inputs were and to make sure that everyone knows that these inputs that have been collected are going to be used in order to frame the strategy. Now, with all the inputs collected from stakeholders, it's time to actually putting pen to paper and drafting the strategy. What I always recommend is to develop that kind of strategy framework that I shared earlier, where we define the vision, we articulate the goals, and we highlight and identify all the strategies. Before we start writing narratives and descriptions, before we start creating a very thick document, we want everyone to agree on the main goals and the main strategies that are going to be part of the strategy. With that in hand and people agree with that, then we move into drafting. Once we have a draft strategy, this is where now we want to go back to everyone that was involved and let them understand what this strategy is. I always recommend we have another workshop where we present this draft strategy, but then we also post it online for public comment and then develop an online survey so people can provide their feedback. After we collect this feedback, we want to adapt the strategy. And then most importantly here, before we finish, we need to make sure we have a strategy implementation committee. Who's going to sign off on the strategy and develop the more detailed 2-year action plan? Oftentimes, this is the same group of the task force that started off at the very beginning, but we don't ask them to commit to a long-term commitment at the very beginning of this process. We wait until they're excited and they feel ownership of the strategy, and then we ask them to stay on and help implement it. And then finally, we need to celebrate. We need to host and we need to have the highest level of government celebrate. I always recommend that you take some time to make it look nice with some graphic design, get it nicely printed, and celebrate with an event so that people can get excited about the new direction for the industry. That's the summary of our strategic planning process. I hope you enjoyed learning about the way Solimar approaches strategic plans and why we believe these are important. A wise man once said, "Without goals and plans to reach them, you're like a ship that has set sail with no destination." Tourism is not the type of industry you want to allow to set sail without a clear direction and someone at the helm. Sustainable tourism planning provides an important tool to bring tourism stakeholders together and define in their own terms how tourism can and should contribute to a desired future for their destination and their community. Thank you, and I hope you join us for our next Sustainable Tourism Learning Series.